Um, One of the things I've noticed is that in many countries around the world, people of different races can get along together, sometimes even live as neighbors for decades or even generations. And yet, when the right demagogue comes along, he can turn them against each other and they can be at each other's throats. And this has happened in India, it's happened in Sri Lanka, it's happened in Nigeria. You can run through the whole list of countries. So that it's not a wholly spontaneous thing. Many years ago, there was an old musical called South Pacific, and one of the less memorable songs was one that said, you've got to be taught to hate. Intellectuals have taught people to hate those who are better off than themselves.
Who are some of those demagogues that you referred to?
Oh, heavens, different in different countries. Bandaranaike, I think, in Sri Lanka was one of the most painful examples. Sri Lanka was held up in the mid-century as a model of a country where people of different races got along wonderfully, and they did. The educated members of these two different groups, the Sinhalese and the Tamils, lived in the same neighborhoods, even though they had different religions. They each would attend the holiday services at the other person's house of worship and so on. That was fine until Bandaranaike came along and decided he wanted to be prime minister. And he then turned the Sinhalese against the Tamils, then others of the Tamils turned them against the Sinhalese. And these people who had never had a race riot in the entire first half of the 20th century began to have riots, which then escalated into outright civil war. They went on for decades with unspeakable atrocities, and more people killed in this little country than the Americans lost during the entire Vietnam War. And so it's a scary example of how at a given time things may look very good on the surface, and yet when the right demagogue comes along in the right circumstances, people can be turned against each other with hate.
In your view, Dr. Sowell, have there been demagogues in America?
Oh yes, my gosh, it's one of the most lucrative occupations. Someone once asked me if I ever tried to convert some of the people like Jesse Jackson or others to my views. And I said, I'm sure Jesse Jackson makes 10 times what I make. How do you convince a man to reduce his income by 90%?
What's the race industry that you talk about?
Oh heavens, there's so many of them. There's the NAACP, which once played a very important role. But one of the problems with any institution that has one goal is that once they've achieved that goal, they don't say, all right, folks, we'll have a going out of business ceremony. They have to go on. The EEOC, for example, when they're there to prevent discrimination. But as discrimination declines, they have to expand the definition of discrimination so that now if you don't want to hire people who have been in prison, they think that's discrimination.